there's 9 points he's raised so far that was evidence for this convention being divinely appointed, and why it's one of the trumpet blasts. The civilization is doomed, the indictment of the old order. That's number 1. 2, exactly 10 years to the day from the starting of the World War. 3, the announcement that the Jubilee has come. 4, it was the beginning of the dispossession of the Gentiles. 5, the date was set by those who had no interest in Bible chronology, because he's claiming the Columbus Chamber of Commerce said it. So they picked the date.
Do they know it?
6, the subject of the public proclamation, not known at the time. The date was accepted, but what message did the public really get? Stay tuned, we're still getting there. So the fact that the date was fixed upon as the last of July, not October, right? Falling into line with the July-August season of the beginning. The end of the 70 years desolation, which had its direct connection with the Jubilee, and that's a whole nother discussion for another time as well. And the beginning and end of the times of the Gentile
times.
And so Rutherford keeps trying to pin more invisible, non-tangible events to prove he was right after all about 1925. And then Watchtower quickly forgot about all of this because, frankly, it's so bizarre. This idea was used once here in this article and not again, as far as I can tell. So it was all swept under the rug and forgotten.
Until now.
Until now. Watchtower history style, of course. So in order to make all this fit, Rutherford then stretches it from 1925 to 26. The things that he's looking for isn't lining up, so he's got to cram more into it. And how do you do that? Make a longer period, 24, 25, 26. So he says in the article, if we have correctly interpreted the matter, if you correctly interpret it, well, you didn't, you dropped it.
Mm-hmm.
So if we have correctly interpreted the matter, 1926 is still the year for God's blessings to begin towards the Gentiles. Still the year? When were they pointing to 1926? He continues, what would be more reasonable than to expect that 1925 will be a very stirring and busy year for the antitypical Israelites, as God will be settling their arrangements and positions in the body preparatory for their work to begin with the Gentiles on time. So Rutherford's entire focus again is on antitypical Israelites, spiritual Jews. He's saying it's all about us, which is basically saying it's all about me because I'm the one taking the lead. And he can't find visible, tangible evidences, so he's got to spiritualize it all. He's got to basically say it's all about stuff that we did, and so therefore it proves we're the chosen ones.
And if it were correct, the Bible would point to more evidence that these were facts. You know what I'm saying? It would, like it did in Daniel, pointing to specific things. It would say, hey, you know, this is what this ram represents. The hairy he-goat, you know, it just doesn't add up.
So the next statement he makes is really telling because he says, it would therefore seem reasonable to expect that 1925 will be one of the severe testings on individual members of the antitypical Israelites. On the Watchtower, he's saying. Did he see the hand?
And by telling you, well, if it's not wrong, it's a test.
Yeah.
So therefore you can't win. Well, we told you it was a test. You know, it again, like I glean toward more myself the psychology of it all.
Remember, he was looking at 1917 and saying, look, that was an evidence. There was trouble in Watchtower. Well, he's the one who caused it. Right?
Yeah.
And so now he's saying there's trouble in Watchtower now. There was things going on in 1925. And so he's just stating what's going on. And he can point back a year from now and say, hey, predicted it. It's the 1925 tower. Well, he's the one who caused it. And that's when you can see the numbers right after 1925 just drop. They lose 75%. Rutherford then has a 10th evidence. And these just keep coming. So he again tries to connect it to July, August instead of October because he's got to make it fit with his Columbus Convention. So he says it was on July 17th, 1917, that the trouble at Bethel culminated. July 17th is almost exactly 7 years prior to July 20th, when the Columbus Convention opened. So the experiences of the church during those 7 years has been nothing short of miraculous. Really? I thought Rutherford brought all that trouble on himself. That 1917, the imprisonment in 1918 to 19, the Finnish mystery, all that was stuff they brought on themselves.
And does God say, when he says 7 years, does he say 7 years in 3 days?
Yeah.
You know, I mean, nothing else.
He continues blaming everyone else for his problems in 1917, right? So he says, in July 1917, it appeared to many that the work might be violently overthrown and the dark night set in. So in our interview with Rood, the violent overthrow originated with Rutherford and Macmillan. And note he says the connection was almost exactly, as if almost makes something true. It was almost true, so therefore it's true.
And not only did we have the discussion with Rood, we're going to do an in-depth discussion on the will, which will explain a lot of what we're talking about right now.
The will, the charter, all these documents that we mentioned, that Rood mentioned in his interview that he had with us, that deserves a special treatment. There's so much to this. All the documented evidence is quite fascinating. But this idea was discarded immediately. There was just too many things he was trying to prove this 1924 convention was divinely ordained by Jehovah. So he continues in the article stating, and he keeps adding, we got over a dozen evidences now. The darkness increased until the spring of 1919 because Rutherford refused to comply with the government. And when he did try to compromise with the government, it was already too late. That's why he went to prison. It wasn't because they were being persecuted, and they were, but we'll get into that in the future, the whole details of that. That's a future discussion. But Rutherford, again, is pointing to that prison experience and trying to find prophetic fulfillments to prove he's the one chosen to take the lead. His organization, his teachings, his new light. Then Rutherford directly fudges the numbers of the interpretation from October to July to fit with this interpretive scheme that he's working out.
And I like the statement he makes. Does it not also indicate, according to dates above given that I just gave you, that the last chronological typical jubilee began in July, not October?
So Rutherford's trying to fudge this interpretation because it doesn't work if he's going to look at October. So he's got to shift it to July. And in order to shift it to July, he's got to have it 10 years from this and 7 years from that, both of which happen in July. But he doesn't have anything in Scripture pointing to his interpretation. And one of his accusations against, or his indictments against the Christians at the time period was because they were applying non-scriptural principles into their teachings. What is he doing here? He's doing exactly the same thing.
Other than making the statement, it applies to me, there's no biblical reference to apply it to this.
Yeah, there's no scriptures here. He's saying, well, because this happened in this date, and it's 10, and 10 is a scriptural number, so that proves it. And 7 also.
Now step back away. He literally started a whole new religion based on this. Think about it.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Basically, when you pull it all the layers away, hey, I did this, and this date proves this. Here, now we're the spiritual Israel. Now we're going to have an Armageddon. Now we're going to survive it. So it really created a whole new core set of beliefs that no other religion to date has come up with.
Not based on scriptures. One of his indictments. It's quite bizarre. he's trying to, he's got to move it to July to fit his interpretive scheme. So he says, does it not also indicate, according to the dates above given, that the last chronological, typical Jubilee began in July 1924 instead of October? And that the antitypical Jubilee may, notice he says may, begin about July, August 1925? Would it be unreasonable to expect that Jehovah will mark that date to the world as clearly as he did 1914? Not really. And as clearly as he marked the beginning of 1925 to the church? Wasn't marked as clearly? It never happened. None of it. And they don't teach that today anyway. So how clear was it? He's pushing now from 24, 25, and now he's pushing even as far as 26 because he wasn't seeing these fulfillments as he thought he was going to see. So he's got to spiritualize it all, right? He can't admit he made a mistake and failure and just move on. It's still got to apply because he can't be wrong. Because if he's wrong, he's not the chosen one.
Religion goes away.
Yeah. So he makes this claim that the Catholics are celebrating their Jubilee, which began on Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1924. The Jubilee door of St. Peter's at Rome was opened by the Pope at that time and is to remain open for 1 year. All who pass through the door are promised a special blessing. Rome is expecting hundreds of thousands to take advantage of this special favor and is making great preparations to take care of the throngs which will visit the city during 1925. How in the heck is what they saw as Babylon an evidence of his 1925 date?
Especially,
it didn't make any sense.
They're celebrating it as a jubilee.
Yeah.
Because only an organization blessed by God would be celebrating a jubilee or given a jubilee. The Jews didn't make their jubilee, they were given their jubilee.
The Jews are also looking on 1925 and expect to see some special blessing from Jehovah, though they do not seem to be certain what it may be. We don't know where they receive their intimation unless they've been reading some of our society's literature.
I have never heard, seen, read, experienced any type of correlation of what the Jews are looking for being anywhere near what the Jehovah Witnesses are claiming.
Yeah, it's almost circular reasoning. He's just chasing his tail, trying to find something to prove he was right. But I don't even know where he got such a claim. I've not been able to find any such thing either. It's very strange. So, and his next accusation is just as bizarre. And another self-indictment if I ever saw one. But he didn't see it that way. So he says, it seems to be a weakness of many Bible students that if they locate a future date in the Bible, immediately they center as many prophecies upon that date as possible. Isn't that what Rutherford's doing here?
That's exactly what he's doing right then and there.
He's got more than a dozen points here, almost, I don't know, more than a dozen points pinning to that 1925 date, and it doesn't really fit. So then he says, this has been the cause of many siftings in the past. What siftings? Not in the Bible student movement, because they weren't really setting any dates other than Rutherford. He was pointing at 1925. Actually, he pointed at 1918, which was another one too. But
even when people,
other story.
Even when the Jehovah's Witnesses want to blame Russell for predicting 1914, that didn't cause a sifting. It wasn't. They were expecting something to happen. They didn't know entirely, but it didn't cause a big upheaval.
Some left. There were numbers who left.
But not like
what happened here. After. So after denying the Jews earlier in the article, now he comes back to it. And remember, this is a short, only a couple years later, and he dropped it all together. So he says, blessing through the Jews. We know the work of restitution must come to the Jews first, and then to the rest of the world. But you were just dissing them and saying they're not going to see any fulfillments because they're not in the land. You can't have it both ways. They are and they aren't.
And then they took it away right after that again.
Very shortly, a year or two later, very, very soon. I think he has to appease his members because he was too harsh against the Jews in removing those prophecies about them. So he's got to add in something favorable about them. But so he ends the subject with a question about 1926. He asks, how much of this will come to pass in 1926 is not stated. So if it doesn't happen the way he thinks, then he can just quietly sweep it under the rug, right? Or put a spiritual interpretation on it. At present, we do not find any definite time beyond 1926 indicated in the scriptures.
Then how could you make such accurate descriptions of trumpet blast based on dates if you can't focus on one year?
And we know the society later, Franz, pointed at 1975. And look what happened with that as well. So another failure. So he says in the article, we see the date 1925 to 1926. Now he's got to make it a span of years. Clearly indicated in the prophetic outline. And the Lord has not lifted the curtain sufficiently for us to see distinctly beyond. We feel sure he will set his seal upon that date as clearly as he did in 1914. Yet, we haven't really discussed this yet, Paul, but a lot of what Rutherford taught about 1914 is not what Rutherford and Jehovah's Witnesses claim about 1914. Completely different things.
Another discussion.
Yeah, exactly. So, his 1914 concept basically is his way to show his 1918, 1919 cleansing of the temple with him as the one in taking the lead. So
the 3.5 years
and we discussed that in a little bit of detail in our first trumpet blast discussion.
So in actuality, he took 1914, used it as an anchor point for his personal dates, is what really is a more accurate statement.
Pretty much. His whole interpretive scheme is, it's got to all be about me. And so I've got to find a way to prove it's all about me. And so it's all related to things that I was involved in. Because he's the one leading the organization. And nobody could disagree with the guy, or you'd be out. And we saw some of that in our the man who dared disfellowship Judge Rutherford discussion. So if you haven't seen that, take a look. So in the May 15th, 1939 Watchtower, Rutherford puts a lot of emphasis on the statement, it was all at that same Columbus Convention, and that proof was brought forth that conclusively showed that Satan is not bound, as some had then claimed. But it was Rutherford's Watchtower that claimed he was bound. And it wasn't even based... So the idea here isn't even based on the documented evidence. That's not in the indictment, really. We're getting more and more details are coming out as you go through history, and it's just very simply touched on and left alone. The question is interesting. What did they leave out? We're getting more and more details are coming out as you go through history, and it's just very simply touched on and left alone. So the August 1st, 1956 Watchtower talks about the ellipsis. The question is interesting. What did they leave out? The first ellipsis actually has a message of hope here, because instead of judging these for their eternal salvation, as Watchtower does now, they were actually holding out some kind of hope for them, because it says that this indictment was sent out to the end that people might know the truth and receive some comfort for future blessings that we present this indictment based upon the Word of God, and point to the divine plan as the remedy for man's complete relief. Now, of course, Watchtower no longer believes that God had a plan, or that he knew that certain things were going to happen. As we heard in our discussion earlier, that when Adam sinned in the garden, Watchtower's idea or supposition is that God had a plan to fill the earth, and that, oops, he had to make a plan B. See the earlier part of the discussion for that. The second ellipsis that's in this article states that the unfaithful preachers have formed themselves into ecclesiastical systems consisting of councils, synods, presbyteries, associations, etc., and have designated themselves therein as popes, cardinals, bishops, doctors of divinity, pastors, shepherds, reverends, etc., and elected themselves to such offices, which aggregation is herein designated as the clergy, and that these have willingly made commercial giants and professional politicians the principal ones of their flocks. Ironically, Rutherford here even accuses them of having elected themselves to such offices. And yet, as we saw in our rude discussion and interview, that's exactly what Rutherford and his friends did. They had themselves elected to such offices. And it continues by saying that they have willingly made commercial giants and professional politicians the principal ones of their flocks. Watchtower has no qualms about using the law where it suits their own purposes. They've fought so many court cases over the years, but it was only to defend themselves for their own rights and freedom to preach. They could care less about anyone else's freedoms or right to preach. They strongly today still state that Christians should not be involved in any marches or protests or anything like that because of this neutrality stand that Watchtower has. Be sure to see our discussion on neutrality because we'll discuss some of that there as well. And yet, if we look at the structure of Watchtower today, what Rutherford created after this is something exactly like that. That they have this structure of the governing body as the popes, district overseers, circuit overseers, congregation elders, ministerial servants, congregation publishers, pioneers, and the Jehovah's Witness community is very, very similar to that of the Catholic Church, with the Pope, the College of the Cardinals, the Papal Curia, the Vatican, the archbishops, the bishops, priests, deacons, regular orders, and the Catholic laity. The structure is nearly identical to what Watchtower's criticizing against here. So if it's a trumpet blast, and these are the things that they were considering was wrong and why they had to make the message, why did they model themselves after this structure? Why did they make themselves exactly like those that they were railing against? Why did Watchtower leave this out? It's because that's exactly what Watchtower themselves has become. In the July 1st, 1965 Watchtower. So Rutherford interpreted this convention in a couple of places before. In the Third Trumpet and the Fourth Egyptian Plague.
Which is very interesting. How can you be the spiritual Jew yet the modern Egyptian at the same time?
That's an interesting point.
I mean, think about it. They were.
Yeah.
It's like saying Jesus is Satan. They're two different. The Egyptians were the ones holding slavery over them. How you can't compare the two. Yet they are now the modern Egyptians. That doesn't follow even logic sense, let alone biblical logic.
Yeah. So here he summarizes the entire Columbus Convention in 1924 as the unscripturalness of Christendom's teachings. Just a short phrase. And, as we've already talked about, most of the teachings that he's denouncing aren't necessarily things that the Christians outside of Watchtower were teaching. It's either misunderstandings or bold-faced exaggerations, right? And the things that Watchtower was teaching, they no longer teach anyway. The ones that they're accusing are the ones they modeled the whole Watchtower society after.
Mm-hmm.
The March 1st, 1972 Watchtower says that this convention exposed the death-dealing quality of false religion. But everything they're exposing are the exact things that Watchtower themselves ended up following and teaching in a few short years. Unless you do your fact-checking and see what was stated in the announcement, it really doesn't fit the facts of the scenario. So we're getting down to just short phrases about the convention and no details at all. Why are there no details? No details at all? Because they don't fit. They don't work. So here in the October 1st, 1980 Watchtower, they state that 485 were baptized.
Actually, I thought on the slide that the convention that the JWs announced, they said 472.
Go to
470
this.
also, didn't they?
They said, yeah, so they didn't say 485 or the suggestion here. It says 470 in the newspaper article. 470 baptized as hundreds watch. Why are the numbers different? I don't know. It's just interesting. They claimed 470 in the earlier magazines. Newspapers all said 470. Here it's now 485.
And it could be an honest mistake printing.
It
The
could
guy,
be, yeah.
We'll give them that. They're not trying to tie it into anything, so it could be a mistake.
Yeah, and the golden age of the time period said 485. Maybe the newspapers reported it incorrectly, but it's the only place I could find that number is 485. All the newspaper reports said 470. I'm assuming Rutherford was so big on statistics, so he's got to be right here, so I could defend him on this.
Mm-hmm.
Stats were his thing, so it's interesting. This is from Professor James Penton's Jehovah's Witnesses in the Third Reich. This indictment tract from the Columbus Convention caused a lot of trouble in Germany when it was published. Enough so that the director of the Watchtower there was threatened with death because of the controversial and inflammatory messages coming out of Watchtower. So what did he do for the next several years? When Watchtower would send the articles for translation, he softened the message. And what does Watchtower accuse him of? They accuse him of materialistic desires. But if you look at the history, who had materialistic desires? I mean, Rutherford's the one who lived in a mansion. And this guy was under the German regime, under the Nazis, and being persecuted for what he was believing. So, very, very strange. I looked up hundreds of newspapers about this convention and tried to paste in like a scrapbook what was claimed about this convention. What were the messages that were coming out of this convention?